Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff to the UN Secretary of State. So it's good to see you again, my friend. Thank you so much for taking the time to come back on the program.
I'm fine being with you, and that was a misspeak, which I will take. You said Chief of Staff to the former UN Secretary.
I said UN, did I?
I think you did. I'll take that. I'll take that.
US Secretary of State would be more correct, yeah.
I like Kofi Annan. He was the guy who told us. Well, another story, another day.
Well, I'm glad you came on to discuss the development of this Ukraine war, which appears to be entering very critical phase because, as we now see these diplomatic efforts, it's important to define a war correctly if you want to solve it. And we have got some mixed signals from Washington. That is, Trump tells us that this is Biden's war, and everyone knew that Russia would respond to NATO's incursion into Ukraine, so suggesting that this is a wider proxy war about the European security architecture. But then he also says that this is a Russia-Ukraine conflict, and the US is the mediator trying to make them stop the fighting. But again, these contradictions aside, it is interesting that he recognizes now that NATO expansion must be off the table for peace. And it also, again, exposes that this is not simply a conflict between the Russians and Ukrainians. Rather, it's a consequence of the wider tensions or breakdown in the European security architecture, mainly creating a Europe where the largest country in Europe is the only one who shouldn't have a seat at the table. So I was wondering, well, if you see it the same way, and if this is the part of a political settlement for Ukraine, what does this mean for the future of NATO?
That's a lot to unpack, and this is becoming even more and more difficult and complex situation to deal with every day that goes by. And I'm getting extremely worried that we aren't going to be able to deal with it, and it's going to ripen into something much worse than it is right now. It's bad enough right now. But that said, there's an old aphorism, if you will, about fighting two separate wars, two different wars. Well, one of the things we're doing right now is fighting two separate wars. And one of the things the Alaska summit did, I think, probably, given Trump's ignorance up to that point and Putin's, shall we say, ability to condense a good, hard explanation into a short speech, he probably got a prize of it in Alaska. And that's what caused him immediately to say what he had not said in the past: ceasefire's out. Ceasefire's out. It's like saying that you were coming in on the closing moments of a war, a rather bloody, expensive war in treasure and human life. And one side is utterly triumphant and the other side is utterly defeated. And you're trying to explain why one wants a ceasefire and the other one doesn't. It's kind of absurd. So he's got that point in his head. But we still have two different conflicts in the minds of a lot of people involved here, particularly the Europeans, although I don't know if it's an intellectual conception or a political conception. I suspect a little bit of both. And that is that we have a war on the one hand that is a threat to NATO, a credible it's going to be Estonia, Lithuania, Poland next. And on the other hand, we have a threat to the Russian CSTO, or Russia itself, whatever we want to call it, the Russian sphere of influence, that is quite different from that. And we're waging the war on each side with the conception that we possess and not the conception that the other side possesses. In Alaska, maybe we came to some similar conception of the conflict. I don't know, because Trump went into the second set of meetings with the Europeans and unwound a lot of what he apparently decided was the reality of it in Alaska. How much of that did he unwind? And how much of that are we going to have to deal with his having unwound? I don't know. The New York Times had a good piece. I don't read that rag anymore because it's a shill for the American empire, but I did stumble on this piece on my cell phone on the online version. And the guy started out and said, European leaders are leaving spas and other events that were important to them and so forth to rush to the United States to get to Trump. The reason they're doing that probably is because they have learned that the last person to get to him is what he believes. And there's some truth to that. How can you deal with that in the sense that we just discussed about these wars, as complex as they are, and ever hope to solve them in any reasonable period of time in any reasonable way? I don't know how you do that. I simply do not know how you wade into one of the most difficult things mankind does to itself, wage war from time to time. States wage war against other states from time to time, and do any kind of solution to the ending peacefully of that conflict if you don't have, as Ludwig said one time, Edward Ludwig said one time, an end that one side is utterly devastated. Think Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the other side is utterly triumphant. If you don't have that, how do you end it? How do you bring wars to an end? How do you end wars? Sometimes it's best to let one side go ahead until it's trounced the other side so thoroughly that it has no option but to stop, to surrender, abjectly so. Can't do that here because there's so many other countries that are backing up the country that's being defeated rather roundly. And then you throw into the equation that you don't have real good leadership on the European side, including Brussels, Mark Rutte and the whole crew there. And you don't have really good leadership on the American side. And you have rather quintessentially exquisite leadership on the other side with Lavrov and Putin, two of the most practiced leaders in the world. And they're sitting on top of probably the best field army in the world because it has done what it has done in the time that it's done it with the tools that it had to do it, refurbished its industrial base, and I think is doing economically right now quite well. I just looked at some stats on that, and has China and ostensibly India as allies now. How do you do this? How do you work this out? I keep coming back to the bigger equation that we're in this colossal power shift. Every single element of national, state, call it what you will, power, educational, informational, intelligence, military, economic, financial, trade, is shifting away from the West dramatically to the East, with the magnet being China. And the West is trying incoherently to deal with the centerpiece of that right now, which is Ukraine, by proxy, and is failing. And look at what we're doing in addition to that Putin has to contend with, because he's the other end of our failure. While we're talking about maybe being reasonable finally in Ukraine, I don't for a minute believe that, but maybe, we're dealing with Georgia still, and dealing with Armenia, and dealing with other places, dealing with the Arctic, dealing with the Baltic, dealing with other places where, we have generals saying we could land on Kaliningrad at any time and take it. He's full of shit, of course, but that's what we're doing. I don't know how you wade into this and sort it out. I don't think you do sort it out completely until either you've had a nuclear war, or you have arrested this shift of power, or you've accommodated it. I'd like to see the latter there, and you're dealing with it. People say dealing with a multipolar world. I think a multinodal world is a better way to describe it, and I think that's the only solution to it. But we're not anywhere near coming to that conclusion.
Yes.
And at the same time, we're disassembling ourselves internally. Yesterday, we had Brooks Brothers suit-wearing, BMW driving DC citizens on the street haranguing a whole bunch of 19 and 20-year-olds who had just been hired for ICE and who were so recently hired, they didn't have balaclavas, so they'd gone to a department store, bought women's hosiery, and wrapped it around their heads. This is the empire, policing its capital.
Well, you mentioned Edward Ludwig. He wrote an interesting article in the 90s. It was the title was, if I'm not mistaken, "Give War a Chance."
Yes.
And that was essentially his argument there, though, that often we we stop the wars before they have played out properly. So the killing stops, but instead of getting a permanent end to it, a decisive victory such as over Nazi Germany, you have the conflicts lingering over decade after decade, such as with Pakistan and India. And it's a title, of course, is supposed to, it's a bit controversial, but there's a logic behind it.
Yeah.
And I actually thought about this myself, this article, because it seems as if in the context of the ceasefire, which especially the Europeans are pushing very hard for, Merz even tried to bring it up after Trump has dismissed it. But this is kind of important because this keeps the conflict alive as well. If you don't have a political settlement, as long as there's tensions, you have a role for NATO. There's also then a foundation for the transatlantic unity. It's a way of locking down the Americans in Europe at a time when the Americans seem quite eager to pivot to Asia. The Ukrainians could contain the Russians to some extent. They could drain the Russian resources over time by putting a lot of focus on it. If there's a future conflict, if any of the areas you mentioned, Georgia, Moldova, we would always have the opportunity to activate the Ukraine crisis to put more pressure on Russia, just like we tried to activate the Georgian crisis during this war to mount more pressure on the Russians. So it kind of makes sense to me that now that the Russians are looking at victory ahead of them and there's nothing that we can really do, this is the point in time when they're supposed to accept a ceasefire, effectively capitulate on their goals for what they set out to do, the political objectives they had, just to dismiss it all in favor of a ceasefire. It does seem a bit unrealistic, but so it's, I guess, from this perspective, it's positive to see that Trump came around to this point.
And mucking in all this are three entities, which I just had a long discussion about one in Venezuela, of all places, who are, I think, out of control. And I'll name them: Mossad, CIA, and MI6. I think there are things going on right now, and Trump finds out about them and often jumps on the bandwagon rather than saying, "What? Stop that right now." That doesn't make any sense. Not only do we not have the resources for that, but I don't have the attention span to deal with that right now. What we've done is we have put these three intelligence agencies out in the field with an entirely new playbook. I saw this playbook being developed post 9/11. I saw it put into practice in 2003 and 2004 in several places in the world. And then I kind of faded out of government and lost track with it. But in the last year or so, I've been trying to pick back up with it. What we have done is weaponized liberal democracy and put all manner, almost the same way we weaponized Christianity when we came to the so-called New World. And we weren't here for the priests that accompanied us so much as we were there to rape the gold, the silver, the emeralds, the diamonds, and so forth, and send it back to Spain, France, and Britain. We did that with liberal democracy. We weaponized it. We put U.S. aid and all these NGOs and Quahogs and others into Europe, and we began to foment, using as backdrop the intelligence agencies to do it, this kind of thing we're talking about right now, which is we're everywhere. We're all the way from the Arctic all the way down to Southwest Asia with these components that are stirring things up and making things dicey for the empire, if you will, but supposedly making things dicey for the empire's enemies. And I compare it to, if you're familiar with, it's Jean Le Carre's middle book or so. It's called The Taylor of Panama. And there's a scene in there where the man from MI6 hiring the intelligence agent that will go eventually to Panama and comprise the book, really. And Le Carre, he starts out the book, you don't even meet this guy until the middle of the book in terms of how he's hired. He's being hired He's fresh off the street, or he's fresh out of the training program for MI6. And the guy who's briefing him is sort of the Smiley's opposite, the George Smiley's opposite. He is pure British intelligence. And so he's talking to him, and he finally, the guy asks him, says, well, where am I going first? Where am I going first? He's eager to get to the field. And the guy says, you're going to Panama. He says, Panama? I know I speak Spanish, but Panama? I'm going to Panama? What am I going to do in Panama? Not to be defeated at all, the guy who's telling him about his new mission says, the Americans have screwed up. They've screwed up big time. They've given the canal back. They've given the canal back, and that was a terrible, terrible strategic move. And we, the brilliant British, have to reverse that. So you're going back to Panama to create the situation into which the Americans will be forced to return. And that's the book. Preposterous? No, that's what these people do. And that's what they've become very efficient and effective at doing over the last decade in particular. And they've been empowered by everything from AI to, the stuff that's being invented for propaganda purposes that Bibi Netanyahu, for example, right now is using to the maximum extent possible. You cloud everything. You're not listening to a person, you're listening to a bot, but you don't know you're listening to a bot. And the bot is telling you that Israel is right and that it is feeding people. They're not feeding people, they're shooting them at the feeding points. No, the bot is telling me this. The bot is telling me this. The bot is Bibi Netanyahu. This is all happening in real time, and it's happening in service of these different state entities that are trying to accomplish their otherwise realistic purposes, I guess, security purposes, strategic purposes, whatever. I frankly think it's gotten out of hand. It's gotten out of hand. I think a lot of the things that are going on right now along that arc of crisis we've created from the Arctic to the Persian Gulf in order to arrest this shift of power is out of hand. We don't even know. Trump doesn't even know from day. Tulsi Gabbard doesn't know. No one knows in the United States government at the top what's going on from any day to the next. And things are going on like what's going on with this guy in Panama. I'm going to create a situation in Panama that's going to be so bad, the United States will have to reinsert forces and take over the canal again. I'm being oversimplifying, but that's what the book's all about. That's what these people are doing. And here's another thing that I learned. The reason the CIA loves to do this, and I'm sure it applies to the other two entities too, but I don't know them personally, so I know it applies to the CIA. They're getting out of oversight that got them in trouble with the Church Committee and the Pike Committee. Remember back in the 70s when they really got their family jewels dragged out into the public and got thrashed pretty hard by the Congress? They don't ever want that to happen again. So what they've done, they've allied themselves with the special operating forces in the military, who are their direct action agents. They carry out the direct action. The CIA then has to say nothing to its oversight committees because it's not carrying out direct action. The military is carrying it out for them. That's what's happening in Venezuela right now. That's what's happening in Colombia right now. That's what's happening in Honduras right now. That's what's happening in a lot of Latin American countries. That's what Trump made public. He didn't mean to, I'm sure. He just stumbled on it, but he made it public by saying, we're going after these drug cartels with the military. I'm sorry, Mr. President. We've been after those drug cartels with the military for a lot of time now, maybe 6 to 8 years. They're down there. They're fighting in Mexico. They're fighting in Colombia. They're fighting everywhere else. There is, people to be fought with regard to drugs. You didn't know that? You didn't announce anything new. Maybe it's new to Maduro. Maybe it's new to the president of Mexico. I doubt it very seriously. I know it's not new to the president of Honduras. There have been some complaints there. So that's what we're doing. And it's out of control as far as I'm concerned. I don't know how much of this conflict is complicated, and peripheral conflicts are complicated by the fact that Trump does not even know what this triumvirate of intelligence entities is doing in his name, in Starmer's name, in Bibi's name. Bibi, I'm sure, doesn't even give a damn. It's money for him. The reason Mossad is in this is for money and contacts and intelligence. But they're footloose and fancy free out there now. and they're doing all manner of things that aren't in the interest of the people for whom they are working and from whom they get their paycheck.
You say things are out of hand and Trump isn't in control necessarily. Well, there's an interesting current case study for this, which is the U.S. General Donahue, who went out and argued that we should consider invading Kaliningrad, that is the Russian territory, given that it's split from the rest of the Russian Federation. It's a smaller territory. It could be taken quite easily, in his opinion. I'm not sure if I would necessarily agree with this, but it is interesting that after all this crazy conspiracy theories that, the Russians might invade the Baltic states, they'll take Poland, who knows, they might end up in Paris. I mean, there's just these accusations over and over again. And now you have a U.S. general saying that not only would this be a good idea to invade Kaliningrad, but making these threats, but he argues there's plans for this. They have trained for this. Now, this isn't part of the conflict zone in the Ukraine war. This is very much split from it. This is the home of more than 1 million Russians who live in Kaliningrad Oblast. So now you have a U.S. general threatening to invade Russia and then put 1 million Russians under occupation of the U.S. Army. And it would be very easy because, in his opinion, again, after this would be done, the Russians would sit back and accept 1 million of their citizens being under occupation by the U.S. and NATO. I mean, this is just lunacy, and yet this is a U.S. general. And one has to ask, how does this happen when Trump is arguing that he's trying to find a diplomatic solution? You do need some trust. He wants to change fundamentally the U.S. relationship, the U.S.-Russia relationship, and then you threaten an invasion of Russia. I mean, this is really absurd. I mean, there's only two possible scenarios here, isn't it? Either Trump is all on board, or he's no longer in control of the ship. It's people are perhaps doing this to spike tensions, to undermine the diplomatic efforts, or just Trump doesn't know how to do diplomacy. It is very strange. I'm not sure what to read out of General Donahue's messages. I guess my point is, it's so crazy, but the craziness is on a daily, new craziness come out every day, so it didn't really create that much of a stir. But this should, have a chill down all of our spines. This is, end of the world talk, essentially.
It is indicative of something that Senator Chuck Hagel, later to be one of Obama's secretaries of defense, said to Colin Powell in 1993. Called him on the phone, and he said, "General," they were pretty good friends. Powell was chairman of the Joint Chiefs then. "General, I'm looking at a list of 3 and 4 stars here. It's on my desk. I'm looking at it. I do this pro forma, more or less, as a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee periodically. You know that, General. But I'm really distressed." And Powell asked him, "What are you distressed about, Senator?" And he said, "Because there's not a single solitary name on this list." And Hagel kept up with the military. "There's not a single name on this list that I would make a service chief, a unified command commander, let alone a vice chairman or a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What's happened, Colin?" And they had lunch subsequently, and they talked about it. And Powell told him, "We have not got systems anymore that promote anybody who is competent to the position of flag officer in any of the services." And he went into the discussion with the senator about what he later became Secretary of Defense, one of Obama's Secretaries of Defense. And at the end of that, he would tell me, "I didn't find that there was anything I could do about it." We have killed our system in the military in terms of promoting competence. What we promote is people who either are sycophants And in most cases, they are in either of these cases, but alternatively, they are people waiting their time to go out and work for Lockheed or Raytheon and make 6, 7, 8-figure salaries for doing very little work. So we do not have, look at Afghanistan. Look at all the wars after the first Gulf War, the last war that was conducted rather rationally. And it happened to feature Powell as the chairman and H.W. Bush as the president and Cheney as the Secretary of Defense, Baker as the Secretary of State, Scowcroft, the last real decision-making team that knew how to make decisions in an imperial setting. They made good decisions. You could disagree with the policy, but they made good decisions. It's gone. It's gone. And gone with it are the commanders in the military who knew how to warfight. We don't have any left. So that's a long way of saying either Donahue was an absolute fool, he was ordered to do that, and then you ask who ordered him to do it? Hegseth? Well, we already know Hegseth is bordering on being a fool. He's a bad manager, lousy guy. I'm told he's going to be gone in a month, making my premonition or my prediction absolutely accurate because I said he wouldn't last 6 months. And the other question becomes, the 4-star in Stuttgart or Heidelberg or wherever they live now, they move around so much I can't keep up with them, the one who's his superior, why didn't he say something about it? Why didn't he jerk Donahue up by the scruff of his neck, drag him back to headquarters, and tell him to shut his damn mouth? Nothing like that happened. I didn't see anything. I didn't see any reprimand or anything go out. But you characterized it absolutely correctly. Number one, we couldn't do what he said. We'd get slaughtered. Number two, we would get slaughtered. The Russians wouldn't take that. And 3, we'd start World War III. And that has nuclear weapons use components to it and scares me very much. So this general should have been slapped about the head and cheeks, demoted to 2-star, and retired as a 1-star. Nothing that I can tell happened whatsoever. So you're absolutely right. We're out of control. We're totally out of control.
It's like for the Russian or Chinese side to say, hey, it would be kind of easy to invade the Hawaii if we just take it by surprise. And then once we've taken it, that's, I guess, the end of the story. I mean,
Oh, and go stand in Pearl Harbor while you're saying it.
yeah, just to appreciate, the stupidity of the thing. You know, it's quite remarkable that these are the people that are now, leading our militaries.
He was another tidbit to throw in here. He was the general basically in charge of the evacuation from Afghanistan. And when I talk to my lieutenant colonel, majors, and other friends, I understand that they don't think too highly of him.
Shouldn't have been some accountability though when they messed up the Afghanistan issue. This was an embarrassment though for after 20 years of fighting. I mean,
You bet. Two general officers whom I've known for a long time, they're both roughly my age, 80s. We talked about this the other day, and we said, do you know that we have failed since the first Gulf War? We have failed in every single military enterprise we have undertaken, and not a single general has been held to accountability. And I raised my hand and I said, au contraire. Au contraire, there was one guy, he came out and was promoted and everything and went to Yale to teach ethics. He lied about Pat Tillman's death in Afghanistan, but there was one guy that Obama, because he became a little obstreperous and did something the president had objected to and did it anyway. And so he was summarily released. You know who that was? That was the 3-star in Afghanistan who was the guy who dealt with Pat Tillman's death in a way that he awarded him a Silver Star when he damn well knew that he'd been killed by friendly fire, and he was trying to cover it up. And so he gave him a High Valor Award, McChrystal. Then he went to Yale to teach ethics, and he's still gallivanting across the country teaching people and everything. But he did get held to accountability of a sorts. Not much, but a little bit.
it's concerning though that that is not a more graceful decline. That there is this. Well, you feel no one's behind the wheel. This is almost more concerning than having some evil plots or deception about the.
Bingo. It kind of reminds me of when I was at the Naval War College, the first case study we started out with was the Peloponnesian League and the Athenian Empire, and of course, a lot of other things come in there too. But we looked directly at Syracusa and what began the unraveling of that empire, and some of the generals, oh man, they are nasty, nasty people, but not in terms of competence as a general or as a warfighter, as connivers and backstabbers and criminals.
Well, on that topic of a deception, I get the impression that Trump has to be fooling someone because he met with Putin in Alaska, and they seem to agree almost on everything. I think there was one issue which was they couldn't resolve, but otherwise they seem to agree. Then Trump's meet with the Europeans. They also seem to come to not all agreement, but afterwards, you see in the media that Trump mentioned that, Putin will be fine if we put some European troops in Ukraine after the war. America might bring some air power. Again, I'm not sure what is true. This is what the Wall Street Journal and other newspapers write, but that doesn't necessarily have to mean anything. But one gets the impression he told both sides what they wanted to hear. You had a nice diplomatic meeting, they shake hands, feel like you're moving the process further. But the next step now is suggesting that Putin should meet with Zelensky. And this is a bit more complicated if they're coming with very, very different expectations. So I can't make up my mind. Is he deceiving Washington, the Europeans, and Zelensky because he has a lot of opposition towards what he's trying to pull off? So he's trying to get them towards the Russian position to, at least meet halfway. Or is he deceiving the Russians?
A little bit of both, I think, and deceiving himself too. That's a favorite tactic of Trump, and when he does it, deceives himself. He just rebounds and comes back and invents another lie or another story. I'm really eager to see if anybody does anything serious about this Epstein business, because I think that ultimately could be his unraveling, and the unraveling of the Republican Party and MAGA and everything that goes along with it. Very serious stuff, I think, if it ever really does get unraveled. But I look at the Kennedy investigation and other things that I don't have great expectations that it will be unraveled, because both parties are in it. Both parties are in it. So I think what we're going to see, and you just suggested some of this as evidence, Putin and Lavrov have already said about what you just said was, quote, agreed, unquote, that it wasn't. So, I think I heard them actually say that a meeting with Zelensky, who said I'd do that. So we've got to see if any of this actually materializes. And if it doesn't, who takes the blame for it and who tries to walk it back or whatever. I don't think there is any question about the ceasefire bit. That might be the only accomplishment that really emanates from this bunch of talk. There'll be no ceasefire. There will be a swift movement, whatever that means, towards some sort of peace agreement. How we assure that peace agreement in the end is going to be, I think, more up to Russia than it is to Europe or the United States. And Russia will probably stick to its guns, and if it has to, continue on the battlefield to make sure those guns are as loud as they need to be. And what that means, I think, is, yes, I can deal with security guarantees, and I could even deal with something that might look a little bit like a NATO security guarantee, but it better not be on the ground in Ukraine. There better not be any aspect of it on the ground in Ukraine. And, oh, by the way, I don't really think that it should be in Poland or Romania or any of the countries that abut Ukraine. If I were the United States, I would take that to heart, and I would get the troops in Poland, for example, out immediately. I'd get the whole shebang of the United States military on the ground in Europe out of that territory. At a minimum, I would move it back to countries that are traditional members of NATO. I wouldn't leave it in the new countries and therefore closer to Russia. You could do things like that that would be confidence building measures. I don't know if Trump even knows what a confidence building measure is. I don't even know if he's ever heard the term. You could do things like that, and you could assure that some of these little side issues that have been agreed to or not agreed to, depending on the point of view and the person you're talking to, are in fact agreed to. Maybe not in the gargantuan sense they're talking about now, NATO forces inside Ukraine, German jets inside Ukraine. That's not gonna go. It's not gonna wash. So you can nuance this stuff, and you can make these little territorial swaps, land swaps, they're calling them. You can make them work maybe too, but it wouldn't be any significant parcels of land for either side. And you could make the security guarantees work. You could, for example, make a buffer zone work if you had troops patrolling that buffer zone who are not NATO, who are not even European, who are from outside, well away, say Indian or Pakistani or whatever. We had Indians and Pakistanis in the Somalia operation, did really well. So did the Turks. Often the militaries aren't as stupid as their political leaders. So you could build an apparatus that could keep the peace, so to speak, but it wouldn't be one that Putin felt was a threat. And you have to do that. You have to do that. You can't be talking about Article 5s and NATOs and things like that inside Ukraine. It's not going to wash. But as I said, there's ways to smooth over that and to get things that are acceptable. And then you got to watch the Ukrainians like a hawk, because it won't be the Russians who violate the peace agreement. It'll be the Ukrainians. And they'll be expecting the United States, just like Netanyahu expects Trump to be with him when he attacks Iran in September or October. That's what his expectation. He's going to save Israel by attacking Iran, and the U.S. is going to come in and help him finish it off and everything. Well, the same thing goes here. They think, well, the Zelensky types, they think that the United States or NATO or both are going to come in if it really becomes critical or whatever, and they'll make it critical. And they'll use their intelligence service to make it critical. Here's a tidbit for you. Do you know who Donahue's main intelligence source was about Kaliningrad and about the operation he was going to conduct in Kaliningrad? The Ukrainians.
This is kind of wild.
You can't make this stuff up. I mean, it's theater, but you can't make it up. If you're in a theater, you would never be this absurd.
Well, but the shifts with Trump, though, they are so remarkable. I mean, when Trump went on and said that Putin had to accept a ceasefire, I remember back in those days, all the European leaders, they tweeted out the exact same message. The ball is in Putin's court, and this was great because a demand had been put on Russia about a ceasefire, which more or less means capitulation, because they're gonna stop without achieving any of their objectives. Uh, and then we have now Trump, who came along with this whole idea. He said it was going to destroy Russia with these powerful sanctions. They were going to crush him. He came with all these threats, and then he goes to meet Putin, and this was all Europeans were excited. If he doesn't accept the ceasefire, Trump will, bring hell upon the Russians. And then he comes back, says, "Yeah, no, we're not going to have a ceasefire after all. Doesn't work." I mean, this is, I mean, I find the Europeans to be very irrational and also committing a lot of self-harm. But I can understand the confusion though, because he's a bit all over the map at times, it feels. But yeah, that's where I want to go. I want to ask you about, what do you feel about the European cohesion? Are they as together as they would like to communicate? Because I'm not sure if it's just strange body language, but I saw Meloni like rolling her eyes a few times during these meetings. Also, Poland was absent. I thought this was,
Yes.
why would you bring the Finns but not Poland?
Not bring the Poles. Yeah.
I thought this was a very strange.
I'm hearing from some very reliable sources inside Poland and Polish people in the United States that Narushki is a different leader, and that he's got to be very careful about how fast he moves. He's got to be very careful about who he makes enemies right off the bat, because the existing structure of the government in Warsaw is very much in line with what you just said, very hardcore with regard to Moscow. But this guy has a brain, and he's using that brain, and he's going to walk slowly and carefully, but he's got a different view of things with regard to Moscow, wants a modus vivendi, and as a consequence, they didn't come. They he made one small victory right away. They didn't come. I think that's great because you got those countries that are abutting Ukraine that are as important as anyone when it comes to settling this and making sure it works. Because you damn sure don't want a rump state. It won't be a rump state. It'll still be a quite considerable state of Ukraine with the headquarters in Kyiv or whatever, with a whole bunch of people behind it who are coveting what it is in its weakened state, or maybe even, wanting to do more with regard to the status of Ukraine from the eastern side than was being done from the western. You don't want that happening. And that is the answer to your question, I think, about the future of Europe. And it's a sad commentary that I make. NATO is gone, I think. It just remains to be put on the grave heap. These leaders are gone within 12 to 18, 24 months. Friedrich Merz, I think, might be the very first one to go once the Germans figure out how to deal with that incredibly stupid democratic structure they have for conducting elections. Macron is a dead man walking. Starmer's a dead man walking. I think Mark Rutte has sold his soul to NATO, and when NATO goes, his soul will go with it. I think this will all look very different in 18 to 24 months, and it's not going to feature NATO as a prominent feature. I just hope that the transatlantic link doesn't go with it. We do not need to sever our relationships for Europe. We do need to come home, basically. We are probably going to fight to keep Ramstein as long as possible and to keep it fully fleshed out with troops and CIA, Mossad, and MI6. That's their principal operating headquarters. That's where we conducted all the operations in 2003 and 2004 and on against Ukraine, with even 3-star generals going down there to deal with the Azov battalion, for example. Very early on in this conflict, we were prepping the battleground, so to speak. All that's got to shut down. All of it's got to shut down, and then Europe's got to grow up. It has two choices about growing up. It can revert to its past and wrangle and dangle and fight with itself all over the place and not be very powerful and be subject to other people's covetousness, maybe, including maybe even Moscow. Or it can grow up and create a European security identity, its own security apparatus, and come together. Not in the way the EU's come together. I think they need to get rid of the EU or revolutionize it completely. It's an autocratic, non-democratic institution. It needs to be different. If it's going to be a federal system, it needs to be a federal system, but then you need a whole lot of changes, and you need a lot of buy-in by places like Paris, Berlin, London, such. And London's already voted out anyway. I think it's a very complicated future for Europe. Very complicated future, unless they get their act together in a significant way and divorce themselves essentially from this utter, total, hegemonic, the other way around, relationship with America. And I thought Trump wanted to do that. I thought that's what his America First MAGA movement was all about, really. And he's not shown me any credibility in that at all. And that's troublesome because we need to come home from Europe. We need to be out of Europe. That's a prerequisite for dealing with this shift in power and dealing with it in a sane and sober way. It's not fighting it, and it's not fighting it from the front lines, as it were, through proxies. It's coming home and figuring out how to adjust our power structure to that power structure, accommodate one another, and then together work on the climate crisis and the nuclear weapons problem. Those two problems will bite us in the rear end. They will kill us, both of them, if we don't do something about them in concert. And right now, Trump is unwinding most of that domestically. I hope they talked about New START in Alaska. I hope the heck they did. I hope that dominated their conversation because Ukraine is a footnote compared to what That means in terms of global security and national security too. I mean, the two go hand in hand when you're talking nuclear weapons. If we don't get a handle on these nuclear weapons before they get completely out of control and into a really vicious new arms race, we're going to kill ourselves. It's that simple. We're going to kill ourselves. And the only way you do that is talk and deal. You don't do it with sanctions. You don't do it with military force. You do it with talking and dealing. And that's supposed to be what Trump's forte is.
You mentioned this difficult relation between the Europeans and Americans, and I very much agree. I would like to see the transatlantic connections maintained, but the Europeans have a very strange relationship with Americans. They're either hateful towards the Americans, or they can't wait to subordinate themselves fast enough.
Yeah.
And you see the same with Trump. You see the European leaders, they very openly hate Trump, but they also, ready to call him daddy and, do whatever he demands. In this country, they sometimes refer to Trump as, possibly as bad as Hitler or the new Hitler. But at the same time, the same politicians, they can't wait to outsource our foreign policy by opening American military bases across the country. So there's no consistency.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if NATO is part of that problem. It would be better to have some distance in terms of not outsourcing security in this way. But that was just my last question. What you said about NATO not existing. So you see NATO as a dead man walking, and if so, how do you see, or how would you see it actually falling apart? Would the
I think it already is before our eyes. I think it's falling apart before our eyes. I think Colonel McGregor, for example, is right when he says NATO is moribund. It's gone. It's done. It's fallen apart. And they have two choices. Well, more than two, I'm sure, but two distinct choices. They can either, as we said in 1991 and 92, to them, Colin Powell in Warsaw, actually, talking to the former Warsaw Pact generals. And then later in Paris, as I recall, Vienna and London, he talked to the NATO generals. And the message was, in essence, you need a European security identity. We'll start out with a brigade, say 3,000, and that brigade will be utterly independent of NATO. It'll have nothing to do with NATO, except should we get in a crisis and it be necessary at that moment, we can exchange equipment. Let's say you need some equipment because it's an internal European affair. Woo! Think the Balkans, for example, which they did nothing about. And you do this because it's internal to you and we'll help you, but you're divorced from NATO. You're not within NATO. And then you grow that up as you can into whatever force you want, and eventually it will replace your membership in NATO. And NATO can dissolve around you, or we can keep NATO as a political alliance, the transatlantic link and all that. There are all kinds of, esoteric visions of what might happen. And then that's the positive development. The negative development is they fall into rancor again. Think, previous European pictures where everybody covets everybody else and you're all fighting all the time and there's no ability to cross borders without a visa. And, you have to wait at the border for 3 days to get your visa or your pass. I hope that's not the future, but it could be if everybody falls out with one another and you get a typical squawking bunch of countries.
Yeah, well, I guess that's been the positive aspect, definitely, of having the United States in Europe, though, that finding this pacifier effect, keeping the Europeans from engaging in, this reckless competition. I mean, just see how quickly they lost their minds in this war on Russia, how things which was unthinkable 3-4 years ago is, that they're talking openly about striking Moscow's, did this kind of things. It's um, I think people overestimate how much stability there actually is in Europe, and if the United States would just leave tomorrow, you can't rule out that the French, British, Germans would necessarily all get along. I know the Poles are not always happy with the Germans. And now that the Germans want to be the leading military power in Europe, I know a few countries that wouldn't necessarily find comfort in this. So it's
Well, that's really why Powell and Baker and Bush, I think. I wasn't privy to a lot of the conversations with Bush, but I was with Powell and Baker and some of the others. That's why they thought it should go slow and the Europeans should literally grow themselves up into their own security identity and keep the cohesiveness of NATO, if you would, and keep the operational sharing and the interoperability and such. And maybe even, well, this was anathema to Bill Clinton, maybe even rebuild and refurbish to an extent necessary their own defense industry. So they didn't have to depend on the United States so much for frontline fighter aircraft and, tanks and things like that, which they did take on board a little bit, but still it was the United States reestablishing its economic hegemony in a certain extent by making them dependent on things like the F-35 and making sure that those programs stayed there. And of course, Clinton turned that on with a vengeance. Lockheed Martin was absolutely salivating at that meeting about the prospect of all these new countries to sell weapons to, because in many cases, the line for that system was shutting down or going into low rate production, which is very expensive. And the defense part doesn't like it either because the products are very expensive, rather than staying in full production because they had nobody to sell to. Well, all these new countries were countries to sell to. And that's another thing. You got so dependent on that, and Trump is using that now. He's using that now. The Europeans are going to do all this. We're going to give it to them, and they're going to, yeah. Well, that's crazy. You got to have your own industry to a certain extent. You can depend on this or that from time to time, as we depend on you sometimes for something. And that's fine. That helps interoperability. It breeds interdependence and so forth. But basically, you got to be able to stand up on your own if necessary and not be so subservient to the empire. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of, in the current leadership, a lot of intent to do that.
Oh, well, when Trump's second administration began, the Europeans were all speaking in the language that this time they were going to really stand up and not be bullied. And instead, we saw taking subservience to a entirely new and level in which all dignity has just been thrown out the window. So we already went a bit over time here. So yeah, I want to thank you as always for coming on the program.
Surely. Thank you for having me.